Okay, just getting everything going. All right. Just making sure that folks are here, that you can hear me and you can see me. Hopefully you can also see a screen. If I can get folks to just type something in that questions box. Hello, yep, I can hear you. Good afternoon. Hopefully I don't fall asleep after lunch, having a nap. If I could just get folks to type anything in, awesome, great. Okay, I'm seeing a few things come in to the questions box. Wonderful, okay. All right, great. Well, now you guys know how to ask questions. So today, at any point, if you have a question for the presenter, which will also be me, we'll come back to that. At any time, two ways to ask questions. One is please just put it right in that questions box so I can moderate that, answer those questions as they come in along the way. And number two, you'll find a little hand. If you want to raise your hand, we can see that and get to you right away with unmuting you so that you can ask your question directly. Or if you want to have a little bit more of a conversation, that's also great. So two ways to ask questions today in the questions box, as well as raising your hand. Or if you need anything else, if your audio or something's not working, you can also raise your hand and we can contact you direct and see if we can get that going for you. So without further ado, my name is Nicole Lambertson. I am the chair of the Center for Technical Development. We're really excited to be able to bring you this webinar series, as well as quite a few others that are coming up. Hopefully you got our newsletter, which just came out this week, but even more exciting, we have a lot of really, really cool training that is coming up here very soon. And I just want to highlight some of those for you really quick. If you go on to our website, and I will share that with you here. If you go on to our website and under training and training events, hopefully that's where you saw this. We've got some highlighted ones, but you can see we've got some other webinars coming up and a couple really special trainings that I just want to highlight if you hadn't already been aware of them. One is a really big training on environmental permitting on working lands coming up, and a special one-time only, live only even, training on managing multiple priorities, projects, and deadlines that's presented by Fred Pryor. So if this is something you need, this is going to be a good one, as well as we've got a facilitation training that will be coming up in May that will bring Ray Ledgerwood back for this 2-day training. And lastly, the WADE conference is coming up in June. It will be virtually this year. And you'll find registration and more detail about that coming up soon. So quite a few awesome things coming up for you here in the future. So without further ado, let's get the presentation started. So in addition to the Center for Technical Development, I'm also the Science and Planning Coordinator at the Whatcom Conservation District. That's my primary gig, if you will. And I really get to enjoy a lot of really fun work. And what I want to share with you today for this special webinar series is some of the work we've been doing with NRCS on our NWQI, or National Water Quality Initiative modeling work for some of our watersheds, and how we've incorporated that into an outreach strategy and how we're using that. So my goal today is really to share what we've done and some of those results so that hopefully you can advocate if it's appropriate in your area to hopefully be able to also do one of these NWQI watershed assessments, working with NRCS partners in your area. And it's just been a really amazing thing, even though technically we are producing these for NRCS for their programs, the amount that we've been able to gain from it for our district and complementing and enhancing our programming is probably almost more. So we've really benefited from this in our district, and it's been really awesome. So as I go along today, please feel free to put questions in at any time and I'll get to those, because there might be elements of this that you want more detail that I'm not providing. If I'm kind of doing overview and you want more details about how I accomplish a specific element of what I'm going to share or otherwise, please just holler in that questions box and I'll take a pause and get right to that. And I'll pause along the way for questions as well, because I know whether I'm sharing the overview, but I know a lot of folks, if you're interested in this program, you want some of those details, and I respect that. So I'm more than happy to get to those as we go along. So first, just a quick little overview of background on the NRCS and NWQI program. So in general, and you can Google this and find a little bit more resource, but their goal is essentially to implement voluntary conservation practices to improve water quality in high priority watersheds while maintaining agricultural productivity. Isn't that what we're all doing? Yes, turns out. This is doing it far more systematically by doing a modeling effort that is attained to that. Actually, hold on one second here. Hold on, I'm just going to pause this really quick and get to a different slide for you guys here. Here we go. Okay. All right, back to it. Okay, so as I was mentioning, this is also a partnership, which is really important in nationally and in our state, that this is a partnership effort between NRCS, state water quality agencies, specifically ecology, and EPA. So this has to do with nationally, where this initiative is looking at those priority watersheds or water bodies that have been identified as impaired and can utilize voluntary conservation. So this kind of has to start by an area advocating for their watershed with NRCS to say, hey, this is a high priority watershed. Ecology has to put that forward, and the NRCS can say, yes, okay, that's a high priority watershed. We can not only do this effort or this implementation or assessment phase, and they need to do this to actually put some of their programs into watersheds like EQIP and otherwise. So in a lot of areas, if you are in a high priority area, you might have NRCS saying, hey, we need to do this watershed assessment first before we can implement a specific program, or it gives priority to that program. So you might actually see these more and more, even if you are not advocating for it directly. NRCS might be bringing an opportunity like this to you. So it's good just to be aware of that. And that, you know, again, their goal is to improve that productivity, everything that we're looking for. It's kind of a cool process that we have been able to put together to really do this assessment. And as I said, even when I go through, I'm going to show you a little bit more detail how we did that and the results of it. Even if you aren't part of this NWQI phase, this modeling still had a ton of really important outcomes for us just by assessing a watershed for where the hot spots for water quality improvement for different elements. And that is what has a lot of value. You might want to do even exterior of this NWQI process. And by the way, our state contact, if you want more information or want to know when this is available or how to advocate, Nick Vera at NRCS would be that contact. So you can Google, or hopefully you have his contact information for our state, but he's a great person to chat with first. Just so you're also aware, NWQI is a pretty big national program, but up here in Whatcom County where I'm at, where now Walla Walla also has a watershed. You can see them in blue here, but we're one of the few areas that have actually advocated for 3 of our watersheds to be able to get into this process. And so this is really special. In 2017, we had a watershed. And this year in 2021, we had 2 more watersheds, and we did a slightly different modeling process for each of those. We've really kind of refined the process, made it actually slightly easier for us to do a large watershed, a large area. So a lot of really valuable outcomes, but this is pretty neat to be part of this bigger, larger effort across the country. Just to give you a little bit more context where we're at, so that you guys kind of also like, oh, hey, that sounds like my watershed kind of an area. So the Nooksack watershed up in Whatcom County is fairly large. And what we did is these are sub or HUC 12 watersheds. So even within these larger HUC 12 areas, there are smaller sub watersheds, right? But some of them end up as a discrete area. So just a little variable. The other one we did was just below this, the watershed, the 10 mile from 2017. One unique thing we have here going is that up here in Whatcom County, we have watersheds that cross the border. I know we've got a handful of us across the top of the state that share this unique feature, but it definitely makes things a little more challenging from a water quality perspective, but it also increases the partnership opportunity, and that's been something that's been really valuable for us to engage. The reason that we've really been able to get this program going is Portage Bay is a shellfish growing area. All of these hash marks are. You can see we do have a lot of shellfish growing areas. Oops, sorry about that. And they are definitely impaired or threatened. We have high water quality issues. We have a lot of monitoring, water quality monitoring that happens throughout this Nooksack River and all of its tributaries. And there are a lot of partnerships already existing in this area. So we actually have a Whatcom Clean Water program that's composed of, I believe, about 9 different agencies, regulatory, non-regulatory, as well as watershed improvement districts, and a lot of engagement from landowners in the area for water quality. So there is a lot of that existing partnership and efforts and interest and motivation to get something like this going, which is pretty important. You can still do this without that. In fact, our first watershed assessment was built so that we could create that. These new watersheds had that existing. So you can start from scratch where people aren't really even engaged in the water quality process at all. And this allows you to present a model to start discussing where are those land features and those land uses that really need to have that outreach component. And once again, I'll get to that eventually of what that looks like. What are the outcomes of a modeling effort? But just to give you a little bit of that background of why this works for us, why we are part of the NWQI process. We have problems, I guess you could say, for better or for worse. So a couple of highlights, as I noted, we're international watershed. These are decent areas, but not so large that this is really cumbersome. We're looking at 35 and 90 square mile areas, so not too bad, fairly easy to model and to work within. And there's already a lot of focus here. We already have TMDL targets in this watershed, and we are working actively as well as NRCS with a lot of landowners, not all of them. We all know there's always certain people that are harder to get to or that we would like to get to a little bit more effectively. As I mentioned, water quality, you can see there's a lot of water quality monitoring that happens in our county. It's an ongoing program. These are even like real-time results that you can get. And it's just to show over time and all the tributaries, and you can see a time scale at the bottom of this, that it ebbs and flows. We've been better, we've been worse. And the point is, when you look at something like this, which is fecal coliform and geometric means, it doesn't tell you much except to say, sure, yeah, this entire water course is better or worse, or it has a problem, but how do you know where, who, or what? And there are a gazillion sources out there. There's agriculture and septics and wildlife and wastewater treatment and so on and so forth, and natural sources, and it goes on and on. It's really hard to get down to exactly what that is. So we wanted to see, how do we go about this the other way around? Instead of saying, okay, here's what the water quality is telling us, now let's go search for the problem. Let's do a modeling effort on the entire landscape to preemptively say, where are our potential hotspots? And let's address those voluntarily and effectively and see if that affects water quality, or see if we can kind of work with coupling water quality with active land work with an individual. So a very different method and methodology for addressing that. So what we looked at phosphorus, nitrogen, suspended solids, and pathogens. Pathogens is fecal coliform, E. coli, and what we're looking at. So looking at this whole suite, some of these might be more or less important where you're at, but it's pretty easy once you're looking at one thing to put all 4 of these in, since we have relatively good background information on all of these. And how the modeling process works is it kind of works in stages like this. So the first piece is identifying terrain and land use factors that contribute to runoff risk. So this is all doing essentially GIS work at this point. And I'll show you what those layers are, but they're like soil type and slope and precipitation, etc. All of those things we can't control that are intrinsic to the landscape. The next one is to identify and compile or create those corresponding spatial data sets. These also relate to land uses. So we have terrain features, and then we have the things that are controllable on the land surface. So whether that be agricultural land use, since that was one of our big areas we were looking at, commercial, residential, septic, and so on. Those things that are stationary that we know about and can control. Then you assign ranking categories for each data in the layer in the numeric ranking. So this is where expertise comes into play to say, okay, for a specific land use on a specific criteria, what is the risk of nitrogen or pathogen or sediment runoff from that surface? And we were really focusing on surface runoff here. That was the characteristics we're looking at. Then it's creating an equation by which to calculate that overall risk rating when all of these layers are combined. So this is where the brains come in, and we had a really great team who worked on all this. We've got modelers and scientists and GIS experts all in-house. So we came together and worked on this, as well as using all of our farm planners and other experts to help us do all those rankings. And there was definitely a factor of going out and land truthing all of this GIS work by doing windshield surveys of where are livestock and what are different cropping for that time period. A lot of these layers that we use are publicly available, which is really nice that you have access to those, including crop mapping that USDA does, which there's a webinar coming up on here soon. But a lot of things that kind of come together. And then we used ArcMap to merge those layers to calculate the overall risk rating, which I'll show you here in a second, and then categorize those rankings and create maps of critical source areas. So these are the essential steps, and you're like, well, that doesn't sound too complicated, but it certainly took a team to make all this happen. It's not a weekend project, that's for darn sure. So what this looks like in the end, and I'll show you the cool parts about this, that these are, I'll show you both watersheds. They're kind of nestled in with each other, but I'll show you how the results differ a little bit. But things like what are all the water courses on site and the soils and DEM, which is essentially just elevation or slope models, and then the precip factors. So these are all the things that are not controllable. They are there. They are intrinsic to terrain features. Similar to the other watershed. And by the way, you can see number one in this region where we're at. And if you're on the Western Washington, you know this, that there's a lot of water, a lot of hydrologic features, creeks and drainage ditches and so on and so forth. They're everywhere. And our soils really do display a lot of variability. I wanted a special note on the soils. When we were trying to relate what are simplistic soil factors or existing soil factors that have the largest contributor to runoff or are a direct connection or just at least have a more cause and effect availability, what we found is that drainage class and or hydrologic class were directly linked. They were good predictors of surface runoff depending on all these other terrain features that came in with it as well. So that was a really important one. It's good to remember that, even if you can only use certain elements of this without doing a huge, kind of the whole modeling, looking at drainage class was really helpful, just to say like, oh, these are probably a higher risk for runoff than these areas are. So that was a good one. And then precip, we get a lot of variability in precip, even moving over just a handful of miles from south to north. It's pretty impressive. A big important one was the agricultural land use. So you can see in our watersheds that we map, these are primarily agricultural. The gap here in the middle is a city, which is also really important. We chose not to spend a lot of time characterizing the cities because it's a project unto itself. Every single lawn and flower bed and finding every single stormwater point is a ton of work. It's a lot of work to do cities or heavily urbanized areas. It's easy to do like a rural plot here and there, a septic, and we can model that. And that was one of the layers that we had, but it can be very challenging. So you'll see we focus largely on heavily agricultural areas with little blops where cities or more residential areas that we did not include necessarily in the modeling, which is okay. I think stormwater modeling from an urban area is a project unto itself, and it was not a focus of NRCS nor the programs that we established in our office. But you can see we have a lot of ag. I wouldn't say a ton of diversity. I want to say we have like a handful of primary crops, which honestly kind of makes our outcome a smidge bit easier in the end for programming with NRCS and or focusing outreach efforts. So big ones were blueberry, caneberry, so kind of our berry crops, corn and forage mostly being grass silage, but we also had pasture on here on its own and potatoes, and then some nursery and other. Livestock dispersion was similar. We have a lot of dairy in this area, but we also have quite a number. They're just small numbers per farmstead of horses and beef cattle and some others. So also really important to map all of those, which we did as well. I just don't have those shown here, but in our full report, you can see all of that, which I'll show you a link to. And what this ends up as, so when you combine all of those terrain features, you end up with this first set of maps, which are terrain, which on themselves, without anything that's happening on the surface, are extraordinarily valuable and helpful to say, what is the inherent contribution of this area for runoff, no matter what we do on the surface. So what you can see here is red indicates a higher risk of runoff to a water body, and then down to green, which is a very low risk to a water body. Again, you'll see the city grayed out in over here in this map, but in this top terrain map, you can see that yes, clearly near a water body has a higher risk of runoff. That's just a locational, which we also included in our modeling. How far are you from a water body? And this green area, not so much. This green area also equates to a flatter area with soil types that had less prone runoff risk. So interesting to watch when you go back, let's say, to some of these layers, you can see this, yeah, there's a very well-drained area, not a lot of elevation. How does that look when you put that, sorry, I'm zipping through. What does that look like in a terrain feature when you combine all those things together? So pretty valuable to see, yeah, there's pockets of high risk. Why is that? So you can go back to those other maps and say, oh, it's because of the soil type in this region is really heavy, or it's very high prone to runoff, or whatever it may be. When you then put the runoff on top of that, so this top terrain map is just terrain features, in this combined, or this critical source area map, is now when we overlay on what is happening with the actual land use. So going back to saying, oh, this was, you know, agriculture or whatnot. So the terrain features, which are just that intrinsic piece. And there was a question here, I'm just going to pause on here for a second, about the drainage class. My point there was that what you'll see here, if we look back with drainage class and just focus on this lower piece here, is that if you look at it down here, we've got well drained, moderately drained, etc. And then you can see that color combo here. So in this area that's well drained, what that means is that when we get rain on top of it, it will infiltrate very well into the soil. It's not gonna have a lot of runoff risk because we have a high infiltration, which is equated to drainage. So we have a very poorly drained soil, which you can see is that pocket in the middle here. That means when that saturates, which it does much faster than others, we're gonna have a very high potential for runoff risk. So really, really high. And we have actually verified this in some other research we've done on edge of field monitoring, where we actually look at runoff risk associated with rainfall, soil factors, and what's actually happening on that land surface. And this drainage class really does matter. So if it's well drained, we have less issue with runoff. Poorly drained, higher issue with runoff. That's opposite, by the way, if you're worried about groundwater. Highly drained means we have a really high risk of leaching down to groundwater. So we are just focusing here on that surface runoff piece. So hopefully that answers your question. Okay, so going back to that, land features, and how then we take this map. So what is this land use? And there was a bunch of others as well. I didn't show, like what I mentioned with the animals and where they're at, farmsteads, as well as septic and some other like gravel pits and so on. Overlay that, and you can see it slightly does change the risk down here. When we look at that critical source areas combined, so that you can see in this middle area where it was just all higher risk just based on terrain features. Actually, some of the landscape features reduce that risk, and some of the landscape features greatly increase that risk. And this is the combine of having a pathogen, nitrogen, phosphorus, or sediment runoff from that landscape. And I'll show you the other one, and then I'll talk about what that means and how we use that. So the other map was very similar, except you can see there was a lot of our terrain features that were relatively low risk because they were high drainage and or relatively flat. And just erase all that background, there we go. And you can see again, we try to gray out the areas when we did the risk, but you can see there's these pockets of pretty darn high risk areas. And what we looked back at, why is that? Number one, it was, yes, what was the land use on those spaces? And that really had a difference in how those were categorized. So if you were a planner and you were looking at this, I would assume your first thoughts would be, how do I use that for targeting planning, for targeting outreach, for the limited amount of time and money that I have or that my district has? This helps you focus that. So you can say, okay, we don't necessarily need to spend all our time in these green areas. These are pretty low risk. They're probably not our highest issue for, things getting into the water course. But these ones, the red colors, the orange colors, definitely are. So let's look and see what have we already done in those areas. And if we've already reduced that potential hazard, if these are gap areas or this is a new place you're going to, why don't you focus there first? Low hanging fruit, if you will. What I will say is this is giving just the potential risk. It's not giving what is actually happening on that field by that farm at that day. You can do that. Pretty cool part of this modeling effort. And we did this with our 10-mile watershed study. We didn't do it with this one, is that we actually created map sets where we said, okay, in this watershed, if we asked everybody to plant cover crop, who can plant cover crop, how does that change this map? And it does, by the way. It's pretty darn cool. If you say, okay, cover crop reduces the risk of sediment runoff by 40% and pathogen runoff by 10% and nitrogen runoff by 60%, you can put that in there and you can see how this shifts to those land features or land use areas that would actually implement and use cover crops. So pretty neat to be able to see, like, how does that shift happen, and use it that way to say, okay, what's the biggest bang for our buck for some of these practices as well. By the way, I want to show you these critical source areas. So this is that combined. In other words, again, bang for your buck on those 4 different parameters that we looked at. But our maps also split them all out. So you can see in that first watershed, the top one, the green being phosphorus, blue nitrogen, brown sediment, and purple pathogen. You can see where there's oftentimes the same hotspots. That's usually, let's say, manure use would have nitrogen, phosphorus, pathogen, somewhat sediment. But then there's some other crops that don't have a pathogen output, but they're high sediment because of their land use practices. And so you'll see there are some hot spots or dark spots that are the same and some that are different. So if you are really focused on sediment reduction, because that's one of your highest issues, you would probably focus on that map. Or where we're at, pathogens is our biggest problem. And so we would maybe focus with this map. You can also use, as I said, kind of that bang for your buck color map, but you can also break it out with all of these different, the 4 different parameters as well. That's the beauty of what we are doing. You can shift these up. If for some reason you have something else that's really important in your area that you have data on, that could be one of these maps. Swap it out for, you're like, oh, we're not so worried about sediment, but we're really worried about something else. And you can just swap those out and look at something else. So a really nice way to do this modeling. We picked these 4. This is what the program, NWQI program, and NRCS was interested in. And frankly, so were we. These are our 4 biggest issues that we focus on from a pollution issue standpoint, and for our water courses for things like eutrophication, nitrification, pathogen content for all different factors, sediment for fish habitat and passage. So a lot of various things we're looking at. So just a few things and how you would then use that. So again, I will reference you to where you can find the full reports on both of those different watershed assessments. If you want to like dive in and you're like, how did they do this? And what about this map? And where did they get that layer? It's all in that giant report. You are more than welcome to print out, cozy up by the fire and read sometime of your own desire. But just some highlights on how you use that kind of information. As I mentioned, it's pretty easy, that bang for your buck kind of part. So really focusing your planning efforts in those critical source areas and or creating partnerships in those areas to say, whoa, this is a land use that is a really high risk. Let's make sure we are engaging the correct partners, getting the best outreach to that area that we can, offering technical assistance, using that to maybe pare down where you want to focus your funds or go for a grant for technical assistance or a land use change conservation practice implementation, that you can use that information to really focus that down. That's kind of what NRCS is using this for, in essence, when they use those results. As I mentioned, you can evaluate the effectiveness of specific BMPs by land use type and practice. So by changing up what is in that model and saying, as I mentioned, that cover crop example, we also did one with how do we find soil types where we could use subsurface irrigation? So installation of water control structures, since that's something NRCS is really interested in. So instead of saying, well, that's a land use type, because it's not, but it's rather equates back to soil type and water course. So it was a neat way to use different elements of that to find where are the best places that we should be encouraging the use of a specific practice and outreach to those individuals. You can determine the impact of NRCS programs in your area. And this is really relative to the program, but in our area, we use a lot of EQIP dollars. And historically, that's all gone mostly to dairy and manure management. It's just been a hot topic. Well, what we found is like, actually, we have all these other EQIP eligible folks that if we could do a broader assortment or focus on them, we would actually be able to make a lot more impact going forward, versus we've kind of dried out this other area, or like all these folks already know about EQIP. If they're going to do it, they already would have, but none of these people know about it. So it was a great way for us to say, hey, look at all of these. They're small, but man, they add up in our watershed. So a great way to refocus, where are you doing your outreach or focusing a group into an NRCS program or other program you have available. So focusing cost share priorities and funding. So in other words, also giving NRCS for all those folks who maybe apply for EQIP or other programs where there's only so much money available. How do you prioritize the requests? These really help that. So if you are in a high critical source area and your landscape rate's really high on that terrain feature, you have a higher priority for getting funds because it's going to matter more where you're at versus someone who's in a really low risk area but just wants funds and assistance to get something done. So this really does help focus the efforts where it needs to go on the landscape. And lastly, adapting outreach materials and efforts. Sometimes we don't have all the effort in the world. We really have to focus that where it goes and how we target to meet social considerations of landowners in the watershed. So knowing how they function, what they do, how we're going to get to them, et cetera, what are going to be those barriers, et cetera, which kind of brings me to the next stage of this, which is that outreach component. I'm going to take a quick little pause here and make sure if you guys have questions related to any of that modeling or the modeling outcome at this point, feel free to type those in or raise your hand and I can unmute you if you want to just ask the question direct. It's a smallish group of us, so I'm more than happy to just have a conversation if you guys have a question about that. Otherwise, I'm going to kind of move into more of the outreach and some of the efforts that we found there. But I'll just pause. I know it can take a second to put in questions. And if they come in, if you think of anything along the way, I can always pause and come back to your questions as well. Okay, I'm not seeing anything in the moment, so we'll continue on. So how do you use this, all of that science? And this is, oh, that's a great question, actually. How long did this process take? And how much did it cost, right? I know those are two things. So the cost, by the way, is a set value. And I know it changes all the time, but when we did these, it was $50,000 was available to do that assessment. Sounds like a lot, but it goes fast when you have about 8 different staff working on different elements of this, and things like GIS are involved, which takes a really long time. That's a slowly but surely. Windshield surveys, et cetera, a lot of hours out in the field because we wanted really, really specific, detailed accuracy on every single acre of land that we modeled. So your resolution and accuracy will also change that up a little bit. The time frame was different for all these assessments. In NWQI, you can, if you get in at the right time, you can have up to 2 years. We had less than a year to do this assessment. And in fact, our first one we did in 6 months, which was insane. It was a lot of work, especially if you're doing the land use and you want to do a really good crop survey. That's kind of a seasonal activity. The rest of it, modeling or kind of the GIS work, et cetera, which you really do want to proof up on the landscape just to make sure it was correct, because depends on the year you got the map. That is easier, but still takes a lot of time. So if you have a year, you're going to be happy about that, just so you can think ahead of time and make sure everything can happen. This isn't like a 1-month process necessarily. And again, we did it at a pretty darn high resolution. You can do this less robust to some degree, or maybe you just want to focus on the terrain. If you're not doing this within the NRCS process and you really want to focus on terrain features, that might take a little bit less time. That's mostly all GIS work, versus when we took it to that greater area where we were adding what are the land use pieces on there, which is really where you can build, how do we afford, give technical assistance to specific land uses. That's what took so much time to add that layer on top. So somewhere a year-ish. So again, it's different when you're given time versus when you ask for time. So, but I think a year is a very comfortable benchmark. If you've done it before, 6 months is possible. A year and a half is great if you've never done this before and you need a lot of planning time. The part that takes extra time, that's the modeling. This outreach component unto itself was a report. And the first go around in that first watershed, where there was essentially nothing that had happened, we spent almost 6-7 months just on developing the outreach materials, because we did focus groups and surveys and engagement meetings with partners and individuals, and we created frameworks for how do you implement all this stuff, et cetera, et cetera. There was a lot that went into that. The outreach from these reports, so looking at the 10-mile, if you want a really robust outreach section and a full report, versus when we did this landscape, it was a little bit different because there was already existing outreach partnerships and or audiences that we already had outlets on how to reach. So a little bit easier, but we still had to do some backgrounding. We also did this during COVID, which clearly meant it was a little hard to have in-person focus groups and things like that. So we really had to rely on information that we already had, or what we could get on the phone with partners, or sending out email-based surveys. So that was one different limiter, but I don't think it deferred or reduced the effectiveness of what we put together at all. In fact, in some ways, I think by us really focusing on the numbers versus the holistic outreach outcome gave us something far more interesting and pretty cool that NRCS was really much more able to relate to, because they love numbers. We're like, hey, this is how many people you reach, this is where we need to go, et cetera. And I'll show you an example of that and why I thought it was pretty cool. As well as we did a nice deep look into the demographics of the area, looking at some of those ag statistics values about what are the different genders that are available, or cultures that are available, races, and new and beginning farmers. We really dove into that to say, wow, this is a whole sector that's actually much larger than we thought, that we have zero outreach materials available for, and that we're doing no languaging for. There's a language barrier for this audience that's really important, and on high risk landscapes that we just never have even thought about, because it just wasn't in our normal programming. So really just looking into the data and letting it tell us what to do drove us out of our comfort zone into this area that we're like, how did we not see this before? And that we're now trying to engage, and I think is going to be very successful. So looking at that kind of this, what you'll see on the screen, kind of characterizing audiences, identifying the opportunities within all those different audiences, creating an outreach plan for them, and then engaging that within the community. One thing I'm sure you guys really know very well is that the whole teach the man to fish principle, right? If we just give people money to do something on their landscape, that might last that duration. But if we can engage a community in the responsiveness of what we're actually trying to do, why we're doing it, and they get it, and we're able to offer not just that specific technical assistance to solve a problem, which is great, but then also to invite them with a different sense of their activity on the landscape so that they can adjust their behavior, so that they can recognize and remediate a problem before it becomes something that's a regulatory issue or seen on a larger watershed scale. That's great, right? That's the outcome of outreach. But it played into this as well by us having a better idea of who those audiences were and taking some time to focus down on what they needed and who they were. And so what we did is we identified what were those primary agricultural water groups in the watershed, which I mentioned earlier. What's their area of impact? Is it a small area so they don't have literally much? Or like I mentioned, some are obvious. They're big, acreage plots, and they're here and there. You can see them on the map. Or they're tiny little acreage, but there's so many of them and they're spread out. But if you conglomerated it all, you're like, wow, that's like 20 square miles of impact that was just spread out like popcorn. So really being able to see what is the area of impact. And then it was really good for us to say, what are their primary and motivational conservation practices? So you guys know as planners, there's always those things we really want them to do, those primary practices. And then there's the things that are coming into the office that they want. Those are those motivational practices. Oftentimes they're the same, which is great. A lot of times they're not. So sometimes those motivational practices don't have the impact we're looking for. And so figuring out how do we pair those things together? How do we get them in the door with motivational practices and have them leave with primary practices? Finding those barriers and motivators and or incentives to get them again. It could be a short-term change, and that's all right. We just need something to happen. And then we have to find a way to get that long-term sustainability that goes with them after that short-term engagement. Preferred communication method and source, depending on where you live, this really matters. In fact, of the 6 primary agricultural audiences we identified, we also identified 6 different communication methods and sources. So they were all a little bit different on how we needed to reach them. Social media versus the radio versus newspaper versus word of mouth, so on and so forth. So it really did matter who they were, of how we got to them. And audience type for prioritization. So knowing, how do they connect with others? How do we prioritize them for low-hanging fruit and familiarity with us? So that last one is easy to see in this representative. And this was really valuable, again, putting the numbers to things. So we said, all right, there's 2 ways. The impact is based on that map we showed, and then the willingness to participate is based on NRCS and how familiar they are with NRCS. So we said, okay, we've got high impact, less likely to participate, high impact, likely to participate. So yeah, they're in a high risk area and they know who NRCS is. Low impact, less likely to participate. They're not in a high risk area. They don't know who NRCS is. It's going to take a bit to get to them. Low impact, likely to participate, kind of in the middle. And when we actually put numbers to these, we said, okay, who are these people who already work with NRCS, who are already engaged in these programs and who are in those high risk areas? We found is that the numbers, no surprise, were really skewed to the less likely to participate side. The likely to participate, these are people who are already familiar with NRCS, who are engaged in their programs or otherwise. And there wasn't a lot of impact there, but in the thousands when we got to those people. We're like, whoa, we need to create a way to get to these people. How do we make them come in the door? And again, it really has to get down to know your audience and or recognize who they were. I don't even think we recognized a good chunk of these people originally because of their dispersion or their history in participating or not participating with us already. So doing some work. In this low-hanging fruit, low impact, less likely to participate, that's always a fairly large number, and that's okay. Those are those folks you don't necessarily need to do a lot of work to engage because they're not as high of a risk factor. But this area up here, very important. So this was we have 834 people in these combined watersheds. We have to find a way to get to. So pretty amazing to look at the numbers that way and then start to drill down into that to figure out what that is and how do you get to those people. So some of the bigger takeaways for you, kind of our highlights, if you will, was that this process really did a great job in helping us identify those high-risk land areas and high-risk land uses and conservation practices that were going to be most effective on those landscapes. Again, that information is great for prioritizing programs, practices, our outreach materials, our time and effort for going out and really focusing our outreach and technical assistance offering to those areas and land uses. Really understanding the social factors affecting BMP implementation is really important. So just taking time to bring in that social science and putting that with your hard science and technical assistance is really valuable. There's a reason we did the outreach strategy with all of these watershed assessments, and it's for that. Oh, this is a great result. Sure, let's do that. And you're like, yeah, but how in the world are you going to do that? So really understanding all of everything about your audience and how they engage, how they get information, how they share information with each other, what are their motivational intrinsic factors and so on. Really, really valuable to helping you actually get to them and get that landscape change done. So our outreach is now really targeted based on impact modeling and community structures. So community, by the way, can be many things. It's not necessarily like the community in which you live, but it's the community in which you associate with. It can be on a large area, a small area. So just knowing a community is very important. And when we actually take this model, and it wasn't easy, right? You start like, okay, here, farm team, here's the model, like focus your areas here. And you just kind of look at it like, how do we do that? So really taking a few minutes to strategically look at that and be like, okay, let's overlay this. Okay, we've got these areas. Who is that? Okay, it's these folks. Oh, we're already working with them. Perhaps now we just need to update the map to show that. Okay, these, nope, we're good here. It's scratch, scratch, scratch. Oh, this is the area. Nope, we've never been able to get to these people. I don't know why. Oh, yep, these are these folks. We don't even have an outreach strategy to them. I think there's a language barrier. Or, wow, we just never even knew that, you know, bunny farms were a problem. Who knew? Okay, let's start working in that area. Let's create a new connection to that community. So really just focusing and looking at that and then bringing it to your current structure of programming and technical outreach. And lastly, you know, when we link this, the goal is like, okay, we're going to do this watershed assessment, link it to these programs, get things done, and improve water quality. Bingo, bango. And you're like, okay, maybe. And you can have very quick improvements in water quality in a very small region if you already had a pretty obvious existing problem. Otherwise, one thing that's important to know with water quality is sometimes it's a long-term improvement when you're looking at a very large scale area. It's great if you find one culprit that's the problem for the whole reach, but sometimes it's a little bit by many sources. And so death by 1,000 cuts, if you will. So just really shoring up and finding all of those little sources. If you're finding like the same thing over and over and over at folks and you can't go to every single person and tell them, that's when you create an outreach strategy and figure out how to get to all those individuals or have peer-to-peer conversations if you get a champion in a community that can then share it out with all their friends. Because let's be honest, word of mouth within your community of engagement is pretty much your top source of getting yourself to change. It's that peer pressure, peer influence, peer effectiveness. And it's a great thing if you can actually harness it and utilize it. It's one of our most effective change strategies. So, just looking at that over time is really valuable and really important. So lastly, if you want to go read all of these wonderful reports, and actually, if you're even interested in this, I highly, highly recommend just flip through the PDF and check it out. A lot more figures in there that are pretty cool and interesting, a lot more of the background process of how we did a lot of these things, and or a lot more content on some of the resources and GIS layers and so on. If this is something you're curious if you even have the ability to do this, or you have what you need, or you want to start advocating NRCS and you want to kind of bring a case forward of why that has so much value for your specific watershed. So it's on the Whatcom Conservation District webpage, whatcomcd.org. And under our programs and research programs, you'll find all of the different links in these bottom two or these most current reports. So I've got that right here of where you can find that, whatcomcd.org/research projects. You should be able to find this page and find the 10 mile and the bigger outreach strategy there, if that's your curiosity with all this, versus those other two reports. So with that, let's take some questions. I see some coming in, so I'm going to get to those first, but just a reminder, please put your questions in the questions box, raise your hand, we can do it that way. I also want to quickly acknowledge my amazing in-house team at Whatcom CD that did all this, from our modelers and outreach and GIS specialists and all the other staff that contributed to all of our land use survey data collection, all the partners who contributed information, and NRCS for working with us in very close proximity as well on the outcomes and how we were going to effectively put all this together, and for taking some of our recommendations for how to improve their program, specifically their EQIP program, for making something like this actually come to life. So that's great. Okay, we've got a couple of questions coming in. First one, it's a great question. How does this fit with PIC projects? PIC cuts to the chase, at least from a fecal coliform and surface water standpoint. Yeah, this does fit with PIC actually, in that PIC is pollution identification and correction. A lot of counties have a program related to that in different capacities. I think what we did is we took a lot of elements of PIC and brought it to this process, specifically that outreach part of it, and or we've been able to take a lot of the modeling results and give that back to PIC to think about audiences that are going to have a big bang for your buck. And otherwise, it feels like, dairy is easy. It's a low hanging fruit. It's, we've got programs to address bigger agricultural operations. PIC has been a great program to get to those smaller clusters of landowners and land uses, or using that partnership to get to more like marine sources. Surprisingly, when you get down to those areas, or septics, or landowners, homeowners, parks, etc. So PIC has been a nice back and forth, mostly of sharing results and or bringing their methods into what we did. I see there was a question about sharing survey questions we sent out and how we categorize our agricultural groups. Yes, if you look at the 10 mile report, you're going to find that in there, because it wasn't easy when we did those surveys, and we had to code them so they were anonymous, but came back so we knew at least what kind of landowners they were and how that was sent. Whew, that was a whole process into itself. And I actually recommend, if you really want a tight follow-up on that, Annika Sweeney, whose name is up here, she's our outreach and education coordinator, and coordinated a lot of that work in that 10 mile report of how we got that information out there. And then also a question about, what do you think about the maintenance is for this tool and having to update the data? That's a great question. Luckily, terrain features don't really change, so we're good there. Climate change might change the precip over time, but that's the great part. So the only thing we would change, let's say if we decided, we have a different land use that came in, or we want to update this every 2 years to reflect the current crop use, it's actually pretty easy. Thank goodness. That's just one of the GIS layers. And we already have what I mentioned in those steps, like the equations is the most important part. If you change up a layer, you just change that, reinsert it, rerun the equation, boom, there it is again. So keeping these models up is not very hard. Luckily, it's just changing, and even sometimes we adjust what we decide are those rankings, or we get new science that may change our ranking background about what is the risk associated with the land use for nitrogen or something like that. We want to change that up, we can reinsert that into the model, rerun it, and there it is. So it's designed such that it's relatively easy to upgrade or update some of those elements and redo it. So I'm grateful for that, but that's a really good question. Another question, wondering to what extent the modeling and monitoring approaches bumped into landowner privacy. Yeah. In other words, is there concerns related to monitoring near private lands? Good question. So 2 things here. All of the monitoring work was not associated with this report. That is already a program unto itself. And it was just results that we used as a check, if you will, to say, okay, this is what our modeling is showing us. Does that actually relate to what the water quality monitoring is showing us? So technically in these NWQI assessments, you're not allowed to do any monitoring except for maybe collection of metrics over time, which is really valuable. But there's no monitoring of water quality associated with the modeling of this assessment. So 2 separate things. However, if you have the monitoring, it's really valuable to validate the model. And thank goodness we just already have a really robust monitoring program by a lot of different partners in our county. And so we were able to use that to validate our model to say, like, are what we're predicting actually what we see? Yes, in a lot of cases it was. Thank goodness, right? But I will say, landowner privacy wise, you'll notice a lot of those maps that I showed you, pretty high resolution. You cannot zoom in closer than that unless you are in-house or this is NRCS. So luckily there is a privacy accountability to it. It's not necessarily, not all layers are publicly accessible. So we were very conscious about whatever we put in those, that the resolution was such that you couldn't see like the dot on a map for a horse farm, that you could find the address. No, sir. So we really try to keep it up, or those crop layers are publicly available anytime. So that you can, if you can drive by and see something, it's okay. So my point being, we spent a lot of time thinking about privacy and not overextending to put, you know, these are not real-time values. These are assessments, they're estimates. It doesn't reflect what's actually happening that moment of time. We wanted to make sure that, so that a regulator didn't take that map and say, oh, this red spot is our water quality source, let's go and regulate on them. No, 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 you can't do that. So we have a robust section that says that, but you always have to be wary of that happening. And so that's why you just are very cautious with the resolution of maps that you provide out to the public versus what you use in-house, perhaps to do your own work. Very good question, something as a researcher, I'm always crazy sensitive to. Okay, a couple more minutes. I'll take, we've got a couple more questions here. Is there NRCS funding available to support the assessment? Yes, so ours were, all of these were funded by NRCS through their National Water Quality Initiative program. So that's, I highly suggest if you're interested in this, you ask Nick Vera, who is state NRCS person who's in charge of the NWQI program, number one, if you have a watershed that qualifies, or how you get that on the list so that you can get this assessment done by or with NRCS so that they can do their programming. So that is how NRCS supported this. If you wanted to do this on your own outside NRCS, you'll have to find a way to fund that. That could be through a grant or through a community funds that come together in your county. Could be a variety of different ways you do that. Okay. Looks like we have 1 minute left. If you guys have more questions, I can stay on and answer those directly, but I just wanted to take a minute to say thank you very much for being interested in this program. And hopefully you have the possibility of doing something like this in your watershed, and or maybe it's already hanging out. Next time you see the NWQI request come through, you have a better idea of what it is and what you can do and how awesome it is. And hopefully you're able to take advantage of that. And if anytime you have questions about this, my contact info is right on the screen here. Call me or email me anytime. I'm more than happy to share content with you, and or make sure that you go back and check out the assessments, the reports that are on our webpage if you want to see more content, because they're way more interesting and in depth. So with that, thank you all so much. Good luck, enjoy your day. A little CTD hat on now. Please join us for our future webinars and our other trainings that are going to be coming up. We hope that we get to see you again here very soon and give you additional information on programs, projects, and professional development. So with that, thank you all so much and have a good afternoon.